Great, thank you very much, Francis. Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk on this topic this afternoon. As Francis says, my name is Amy Rogers. I'm a clinical lecturer at the University of Dundee. My background is actually as a medical practitioner, as a general practitioner, GP in the UK, and I concentrate at the moment on research methodology, particularly in clinical trials. So I'm going to talk this afternoon about ethical considerations for decentralised clinical trials. But before I do that, I need to tell you that what I'm talking about today is coming out of work that I've done as part of the Trials at Home project, which is a public-private partnership project funded by the European Commission and FPA, which is an organisation representing pharmaceutical companies. And as you can see from this slide, we have a large number of pharmaceutical companies, smaller and medium enterprise, academic and third sector organisations in the project. So it's a very large project, and because of that, I need to show this slide as well, which is a disclaimer to say that anything I say in this presentation is my own personal view and can't be assumed to be the view of anyone else involved in the project. So with that out of the way, what on earth is a decentralised clinical trial? Well, it's not a particularly helpful term. Decentralised means different things to different people, but it is the term that the clinical trial community seems to have settled on to describe a particular concept in trials, which is this idea that trials can be designed so that the majority of trial activities take place where patients or participants usually are. So in practicality, that means either in their home or in a local workplace, education or healthcare setting. And the purpose of that is to minimise the number of visits that have to be made to trial centres. If you're aware of conventional clinical trials, they often involve several visits to a trial centre, which may be far away at a tertiary hospital, and these can take place over several weeks or months. So the idea is that by getting rid of this, you make it easier for people to take part in trials. And these days, most decentralised clinical trialists are using digital innovations to permit this movement of activities from these trial sites to participants' homes. So I think you're probably already getting the idea that it isn't a sort of all or nothing thing. Conventional trials, yes, they usually involve visits to trial sites. But these days, most conventional trials do involve some degree of data collection that takes place outside of trial visits, be that with an e-diary or with telephone follow-ups. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the fully remote decentralised trial, where patients and participants never visit a study site and everything is done remotely. And in practice, most trials exist somewhere between these two extremes. And the nature of the patient community and the research question that's being answered will determine where on this spectrum the trial can lie. So we've conducted some research into methods that have been used to conduct decentralised clinical trials, and also looking at what people have been saying about decentralised trials. And it's clear that it's being promoted as a potential improvement on conventional trials. As I've already mentioned, the whole idea of moving things to the patient's home is to make things easier for participants. It should make it easier to take part in a trial, and that should stop people from dropping out. Ideally, if people are taking a more active part in their trial participation, they may then feel more of a sense of ownership of the trial. And the digital technologies that we use to enable decentralisation can also provide real-time feedback that people might find useful for managing their own healthcare. From an investigator point of view, decentralised clinical trials have been suggested as being faster because they recruit faster and they don't lose patients through lack of engagement and lack of adherence. The digital technologies can allow real-time safety and monitoring of other aspects of trial conduct. There should be far less manual data entry and potential for mistakes, and thus the trial should be more cost-effective. And ultimately, that's better for the wider community. It should mean that we have faster and cheaper access to the outcomes of these trials. Theoretically, if participants are taking part from their own home, the generalisability of the results should be better. And maybe the potential participants will come from a more diverse group because there are fewer barriers to participation. It may even allow people with rare diseases to take part in trials that they wouldn't be able to reach otherwise because they live far too far away from the participating centres. And as we've seen recently during the Trials at Home project, the restrictions that came in as a result of the COVID pandemic allowed many trials that were either decentralised to begin with or became decentralised to ride out some of the storm of the pandemic restrictions. So, sorry, just to go back there, I would just like to point out that although all these positive potential advantages have been raised, we did not find sufficient evidence in our systematic review of a benefit in terms of recruitment, retention, or cost. That doesn't mean that there isn't a benefit, simply that there was no evidence to back up those statements yet. So I'm going to discuss the ethical principles that I believe should be applied to decentralised clinical trials, as they should be applied to any clinical trial, and these won't be unfamiliar to you. So starting with social and clinical value. I've already explained that people think these decentralised trials should make trials easier, cheaper, and faster to do. And that should mean that trials which have previously been impossible may suddenly become feasible. And that is a benefit. And equally, the results of trials done in this way should be more generalizable and easier to apply to healthcare. The first question that always is raised about decentralized clinical trials, though, is it valid? Are the answers that come out of these trials actually true? And we need to think about this very carefully. Are we measuring what we think we are? It's really important that any measurements that are being done in a decentralized trial, particularly using new digital tools, are subject to validation studies. We may not be able to use source verification as we would in a conventional trial where monitors will go in and check the health records directly. But there are opportunities with decentralization around the movement of data, tagging of data by attribution so that we know who's entered it and when, clear audit trails, and using metadata and trend analysis to look for potential problems with missing data. Are we collecting the data properly? Well, even in a conventional trial, we would expect the research staff to be trained properly in how to collect the data. In a decentralized clinical trial, if you have patients collecting data, they too need to be trained and they need to be provided with the technical support that they'll need in order to collect the data. And it may be that run-in periods will be particularly useful in these types of trials to allow people to practice with the technology before the trial starts. And do we have all the right data? It's really important that data flows in decentralized trials are transparent and that there is a method for tagging missing data. Because if patients are not coming in for regular study visits, there's no one checking up that they filled in their questionnaires. But you can do that with technical solutions. And there's no reason why you cannot have research nurses doing what they would have done in an in-person appointment. So that brings me on to fairness and equity. The argument is that decentralized clinical trials should be more accessible for people. People who may not be able to travel to a tertiary site for a site visit, people who have other demands on their time, such as employment or caring responsibilities, and people who physically struggle to travel should be able to take part in these trials more easily than they would in the average conventional trial. However, we do need to consider the fact that if the trial is using digital tools such as smart apps, wearables, things that require an internet connection, then there is a potential for digital exclusion. If the potential participants are not comfortable using the technology or don't have access to the necessary hardware, software, or internet connection, then you may actually be excluding parts of the population who you really want to take part in the trial. And I should just say here that we do have a publication coming out shortly on diversity in trial populations, looking at whether decentralized trial designs are better or worse in terms of different measures of diversity. But it all comes down to balancing risk and benefit. And another big concern with decentralized trials is safety. It's very important that the trial is designed in such a way that the physician in charge has oversight of the participants. This may actually be better in some decentralized clinical trials because a centralized system, although it's called a decentralized trial, may allow the chief investigator to see all trial participants and to see their data live rather than waiting for it to be sent up the chain from a site. Another aspect that's often raised is what do we do about adverse events? What if the patient feels unwell? How do they know what to do? Well, just as in a conventional trial, when there are periods between trial visits, participants need to be taught and supported to know what needs to be reported and what doesn't, who to contact and when, and how to contact them. So I don't think this is really any different from a conventional trial, but communication becomes very important when you don't have regular face-to-face contacts. Another concern that comes in, particularly with the use of digital technologies, is privacy and confidentiality. If you're coming to a trial site and having a visit and then going back to your daily life, no one around you need know that you're taking part in a clinical trial. But if you're being required to regularly enter data into an app or wear a wearable that's visible to the people around you, that may be advertising to people that you don't want to know that you're taking part in a trial. And that doesn't even cover the idea of what about the security of the data when it's being transmitted from the patient's home to other places. And finally, I think what's really the biggest issue in decentralized clinical trials, burden. In our research, we have identified that there is a potential in a decentralized trial for the burden, the work of a trial, to be transferred from study staff who are paid to participants who are not. Now, a high burden may put people off. They may not sign up in the first place. They may sign up but then drop out quickly or not create data that they're supposed to. But I think even more importantly, there is a potential for exploitation here if patients are being asked to do something that previously would have been done by a paid member of staff, particularly if we're talking about a trial in a rare disease or orphan disease situation, where the trial may be people's or may be perceived as people's only realistic hope of effective treatment. But it comes down to balancing risk and benefit. I think an important point was made earlier that research ethics committees make judgments on a case-by-case basis. A lot of the discussion about decentralized clinical trials has been looking at comparisons between conventional trials and decentralized trial. But the decisions as to whether a trial should go ahead or not should be made on the basis of that trial alone and the balance of risk and benefit within it. My colleagues in the Trials at Home project have actually published a paper about which benefits can justify risks, and they go into much more detail about the concept of collateral benefits in terms of feasibility and generalizability. And I'd encourage you to read that paper if you're interested in that. Very briefly, I want to mention informed consent. Just to say that e-consent is not the same as remote consent. Most conventional trials are now experimenting with using e-consent, but when you are achieving consent remotely, whether electronically or using other methods, it's important to ensure that people understand what they're signing up to, and digital technologies may make that easier by allowing audio and visual communication. It's important to record decision making, and that can be done using PDFs and accessible web records of consultation. And the technology also brings in the possibility of dynamic consent, where people can opt in and out of parts of trials. That brings me on to emerging ethical concerns in DCTs. And I think one big thing that is coming onto the horizon is the issue of choice and flexibility in all clinical trials. And the idea that perhaps people don't have to sign up to everything all at once at the beginning of a trial. And their preferences may change as to where the study activity takes place or what activities they take part in. It's not yet clear what that's going to look like, and there will be ethical concerns around it. And then ethical concerns about artificial intelligence, which seem to be making it into every discussion at the moment. Artificial intelligence is already being used in wearable devices that are designed to collect data. Clinical trial companies are already experimenting with artificial intelligence to rationalize and improve their backroom processing of documents. So we will see artificial intelligence coming into patient-facing aspects. So just to close up, we still need empirical evidence on benefits and harms of decentralized methods to inform ethical decision-making. And this decision-making and discussions, I was really pleased to see Lynn just presenting before me, this should involve patients and potential participants through PPI and co-production, because everybody is different. We shouldn't be making assumptions about what will suit one person or one group of people. So that's all I wanted to say. We have a number of relevant publications from the Trials at Home project. You can see them all at trialsathome.com. Here are my contact details, and I'd be very happy to take questions in the panel. Thank you.